The barracks were buzzing with the usual blend of chatter, clinking boots, and the faint smell of metal polish that clung to us like a stubborn reminder of discipline. Yet amidst the rigid environment of the training camp there was one figure who drew more attention than she had ever wanted, a woman named Elira, simple in appearance and demeanor, who had signed up not out of ambition for glory or to prove herself but because she carried a quiet promise to her late father who had always told her that strength came not from words but from enduring what others believed you could not. And as she walked into the training yard on that first day, her loose braids swaying against the rough fabric of her uniform, whispers followed her like shadows, mocking laughs tucked behind palms and muffled smirks that grew bolder when she stumbled slightly under the weight of her issued gear, the men and even some of the women cadets making bets under their breath about how quickly she, who belonged in a world of shouting sergeants and endless drills, her face soft where theirs were sharp, her frame lean but not hardened by years of sport or fighting, and though she heard every word she did not respond, keeping her gaze steady on the dirt path ahead as if to convince herself she had not noticed the jeers, yet in truth they pierced her like arrows she dared not pull out. And so the days unfolded with grueling runs under the merciless sun, push-ups that turned arms to trembling reeds and weapons drills that demanded precision her unsteady hands struggled to master, the laughter always there, echoing when she lagged behind on the obstacle course, when her knees buckled during a march, when her voice cracked as she shouted the required responses. But within her silence there was a reservoir no one suspected, a quiet resilience born not from arrogance but from carrying scars invisible to those who thought only muscles or loudness defined strength, and each night when the barracks grew silent and most collapsed into uneasy sleep she would pull off her jacket carefully, the thin fabric sticking to her sweat-damp back, and she would glance at her reflection in the scratched mirror bolted near the washroom, not at her face, not at her exhausted eyes, but at the ink that sprawled across her skin, a tattoo hidden beneath layers of cloth that none of her fellow cadets had seen, a piece of her history etched so deeply it seemed to pulse with its own life, the lines twisting into a symbol older than the unit she trained for, older perhaps than the commanders themselves, a mark her father had once told her was the heritage of warriors who had stood their ground when kingdoms fell, and though she rarely thought of it during the endless hours of training, it remained there like a secret fire, waiting, while the camp around her continued to grind her down, and by the end of the first month she was known. Not by name but by ridicule, the farmer girl, the quiet mouse, the one who won't last, labels spoken loud enough to sting but not loud enough to draw the reprimand of instructors who themselves seemed to watch her with doubt. And yet there came a morning unlike the rest, when the commander himself strode into the yard for inspection. His voice sharp enough to cut through the fog as he ordered everyone to strip down to undershirts for the evaluation of fitness, marks etched across shoulders from the grueling weight of packs, and in that moment Elira hesitated, her fingers trembling on the hem of her shirt, not because she feared exposure of weakness but because she knew what lay beneath, the design that until now had been her private burden, but she obeyed, tugging the fabric upward in one motion, the cool air biting her sweat-slick skin as the murmurs began, first hushed and curious, then growing louder as eyes widened not in laughter but in shock, for stretched across her back was no simple decoration but an emblem recognized even by those too young to understand its depth, a crest once worn by a legendary unit disbanded decades before, a mark reserved for bloodlines tied to acts of valor whispered about in the academy halls, and as the commander's gaze landed upon it, his stride faltered, his lips parted as though words had failed him, the camp that had mocked her only hours before suddenly holding its breath, for the simple woman they had ridiculed stood revealed as something else entirely, though she herself merely lowered her eyes, saying nothing, letting the silence stretch into a weight heavier than any gear she had carried, a silence that belonged not to weakness but to power unspoken, a silence that left the commander himself struggling to reclaim authority as he took a step closer, unable to mask the flicker of recognition, respect, and disbelief that crossed his hardened face. The stillness that followed the commander's stunned gaze seemed to freeze the entire training ground, the cadets who had once laughed at Elira now staring with an uneasy mixture of confusion and awe, and though the inspection resumed with his clipped commands, the tone of the yard had shifted irreversibly. Words began to ripple through the ranks, questions about how someone so unassuming could bear a mark that most had only seen illustrated in dusty manuals, a crest tied to a unit whispered about like a myth, a unit whose courage was said to have turned the tide of wars, and yet none dared ask her directly, for the commander's expression alone was enough to warn them that this was no trivial matter, and Elira herself, after pulling her shirt back down, kept her eyes lowered as if nothing had changed, though inside her chest her heart pounded like a drum, each beat carrying the echo of her father's words about heritage, sacrifice, and the burden of carrying something others would not understand until the right moment, and as the drills of the day resumed she found the laughter conspicuously absent, the mocking voices silenced not by guilt but by uncertainty, for no one knew whether they had been mocking someone far above their station, and in the days that followed she noticed subtle changes, the way her peers no longer shot past her in line, the way instructors who had once ignored her progress now scrutinized her form as if measuring potential they had overlooked, and most of all, the way the commander himself lingered longer. During exercises, his sharp eyes not filled with the usual disdain for stragglers but with something like calculation, a weighing of her presence against memories he did not share, and though she endured the same pain, the same exhaustion, the same blisters that split open during marches, she felt the pressure of unseen expectations settle on her shoulders, as though the tattoo on her back had branded her not just with history but with responsibility, and it was during a storm-soaked night when this weight first revealed itself in words, for as thunder rattled the barracks and rain lashed against the tin roofs, she was summoned by an aide to the commander's office, her boots squelching on the muddy path as unease tightened in her stomach, and when she stepped into the dimly lit room she found him seated behind a desk bearing a folder thick with yellow documents, his posture stiff, his eyes sharp yet weary, and he gestured for her to sit, though his voice when he spoke was lower than the bark of orders she was used to, asking her if she knew the meaning of the mark she carried, and though she nodded, telling him only that it had belonged to her father and his father before him, she withheld the deeper truth, that her father had pressed his hand to the tattoo when she was a child and told her it was a reminder that silence could outlast ridicule, that true strength did not seek recognition but revealed itself when others least expected it. Yet the commander leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper as he confessed that he had once served under the last captain of the unit whose crest now marked her back, a man whose reputation still haunted the military as a figure both feared and revered, and to see that same emblem inked into her skin had shaken him more than he dared admit in front of the others, for granted only to those born into a bloodline that had sacrificed beyond comprehension, and though Elira listened in silence, her hands folded tightly in her lap, inside her a storm raged, for she had never expected her secret to bind her so suddenly to a legacy she had only half believed, and when the commander at last leaned back and dismissed her with words she could scarcely process, warning her that carrying such a mark would make her both a target and a torchbearer, she rose slowly, bowed her head, and stepped back into the rain, her mind swirling with the realization that her training here was no longer just about surviving mockery or proving doubters wrong, but about living up to ghosts who had shaped the very fabric of the army she now served, and though fear gnawed at her, she also felt a strange steadiness, as if the ink on her back pulsed not only with history but with strength she had not yet tapped, and as she returned to her bunk, the storm outside mirroring the turmoil inside, she understood that from this night onward the eyes of not just her peers but of the commander himself would follow her every step, waiting to see whether the simple woman they had dismissed would rise into the figure her tattoo demanded or collapse under the weight of a legacy carved in flesh and blood. The days that followed blurred into a relentless rhythm of drills, shouted orders, aching muscles and sleepless nights, yet beneath the surface of routine something had shifted irrevocably, for though Elira still rose before dawn with the same weary groan as the others and still stumbled at times under the crushing weight of her pack, the silence that once mocked her had turned into silence that watched her, studied her, measured her with eyes uncertain whether to fear or to follow, and she felt the sting of that attention like the burn of a fresh wound, every motion scrutinized, every mistake magnified, yet she refused to falter, not out of pride but because she knew each step forward was another refusal to surrender,